So this is a story about two Glendale architects, and it's also about the support of a village that really helped launch an architectural firm. And it's also about how the Proctor family helped a lot of families in Glendale that were in need at different times, and they really helped the Woodward family. And they helped the launching of this baby architectural firm in 1904. But before I start, I just want to thank so many people in Glendale who helped us come together. I couldn't have done it without GHP and without Martin and Joanne and the team of volunteers, and you did so much Xeroxing for me, and files were put back and boxes were pulled out, and it was just invaluable. And it's so much fun to come and just do raw research with real research materials. Also invaluable with Beth Sula-Barger, because we're the quintessential architecture nerdy girls. And I would go, oh, I found another Garber and Woodward house, you want to go look? And she'd go, yes, of course. So we were looking at one in Milford yesterday, Tom Fremont's house. I also want to thank my cousins, Francie and John Pepper, and my cousin, Patty Garber Muir. They helped me with researching about our family home, 28 Oak Street. And I've got cousins here, and they're still architects in our family. And then there's another distant, so anyway, so I also am really appreciative of the families in Glendale who received a letter in the mail saying, I know this sounds really weird, but I'm writing a novel about my grandmother, and a scene in the novel took place in your house, and could I come and look at your house? So I have details, and my grandfather, I've just discovered, designed your house. A few of those people responded, not all of them. But I really want to thank Mark and Jan Godby, Jan and Mark Welsh, Ralph and Barbara Hoop, Bobby Jo Ellers and her family for multiple visits, Beth Lukes and Terry Noble, and Mark Linder, who has a house in Norwood that we went and looked at. So let me start with how my family arrived in Glendale. So on the right are is the Woodward Garber extended family. This photo was in about 1904. So my father's family moved to Glendale in 1886. And my father, the last of the Garbers, died here in 1994. So I started returning to the village when I was researching my book, Implosion, which some of you read. I heard it sort of sent shockwaves through the village. But I started coming back here to do research and to remember about the house I grew up in and connect with people and find stories. And so that sort of got me coming back to Glendale, and then sort of research is very seductive and you just want to keep doing more research. So anyway, that's the Garber Woodward side of the family. And then my mother's side of the family, the Roloffs, my grandfather was accepted a position of the head of the philosophy department in 1932. So during the height of the Depression, they moved to Albion Avenue. They lived in two houses on Albion Avenue across from the convent for 30 years. And then they moved in 1960. My mother and her sister both married people in the village. So there's this sort of this intertwining of families that have kept, I'm fourth or fifth generation. But so here are the two houses that started my research. So I wrote to them that I was researching about my grandmother and scenes that took place. One of them was a scene in their living room. This is sort of like Clue. One was a scene in their living room, one was a scene in their dining room. And so the first house I went to was 740 Congress, which is where, who I knew was Aunt Edith, who is Louise Allen's mother-in-law, the Edith Laboido Allen, and her husband Marston lived in this house. And when I was a kid, I would shortcut through their yard every day on my way to Glendale Elementary School. And as I toured the house and going through it, I discovered that my grandfather, Frederick Garber, had designed the house. And I thought, I walked by this house every day and I never knew my grandfather had designed it. And I thought, I wonder if my father and his brothers even knew, because it was built in 1911, before they were all born. And while we were looking through the house, and then Mark pulled out deeds. Now, I'm not usually someone who's interested in deeds or can read them or understand them, but I happened to see Ada Woodward bought the property in 1910, and I went, that's a cousin. She bought this land? So that just went in my head, and I ignored it, and then I went on. So the second house I went to was 405 Albion Avenue, was where Miss Mary Johnston lived. And she was a really good friend of my grandparents. And there was a scene that took place in her library and a scene that took place with different paintings in her house. And Terry Noble, who was an oblate with the Sisters of the Transfiguration, we walked all around the house. We tried to figure out which proctor was which and how were they related to everyone in Glendale. And I started piecing all these questions together. I remember growing up here as a kid, everybody seemed related, but I couldn't figure out how. So I finally figured it out because the original Mr. Proctor, William Proctor, had 10 children, and then William Alexander Proctor had 5 children, and then William Cooper Proctor, I forget how many children he had, but anyway, oh no, none, right, that's part of the story. But it's like, that's how they married into this family and that family, and it was like, I've been piecing these puzzles together. I feel like one of the things we do when we grow older is that we have a chance to put the puzzles together that we never understood when we were kids. So I felt like I was putting together pieces that I hadn't understood from childhood. So anyway, so when I was walking through this house, she didn't know who was the architect, but I kept looking at it going, this seems like a Garber and Woodward house. And then I went to Martin and I went to Beth and they looked at these, and we somehow figured out it was a Garber and Woodward house. So I thought, how many more are there in Glendale? I was really curious. And I realized at the same time, I had never known my grandfather. He died in 1950 and I was born in 53. So I had never met him, but he was such a presence because of the buildings he designed. So there are a lot of people in Cincinnati who may not know Garber and Woodward now, but they know his buildings. There's the Union Central Life Tower, or the PNC Tower. There's the Dixie Terminal Arcade, which even though it's pretty empty and not much happens there, it's still magnificent. So the next time you're walking down 4th Street, go in and see the arcade. It's just beautiful. And then they designed so many different schools. So they're known for Walnut Hills and Withrow and a lot of other smaller schools out and all around the Cincinnati area. They also designed 4 wings at the Cincinnati Art Museum. And I discovered when I was doing research at the Art Museum this incredible drawing. There were plans before the Depression for the Pantheon to arrive in Cincinnati and cover the hilltop, but the grand plan didn't happen. But the drawing is amazing. But anyway, let's go back to the beginning of how Garber and Woodward started as an architectural firm. So we'll start in Glendale at 28 Oak Street. Clifford grew up at 28 Oak Street, and his family had moved here in 1886 from Mount Auburn. And his father, Henry Lynd Woodward, sang in the choir at Christ Church, Glendale, where he met William Alexander Proctor. A few years later, Henry Woodward, who was a banker downtown, fell on 4th Street, broke his kneecap, and within a few more years, he became completely disabled. William Alexander Proctor heard about this at church and came to visit his wife, Martha Woodward, after church and said he'd like to help, that he would offer jobs to any of the 4 Woodward boys. So the oldest was George. He was 15. It was summer. He immediately went down there and he became an office boy. He went back to school and went, this is ridiculous. And he started working at P&G and he worked there for the next 50 years. And he became the 3rd treasurer of Procter & Gamble. Over the generations in our family, there were 8 more Garbers and Woodwards who worked with Procter & Gamble. So that's that end of this combination of Garber and Woodward. So here's Frederick Garber, who grew up over the Rhine. His parents were 1st generation Germans. His father was born in Hanover. His mother was born in the States. Frederick remembered swimming in the Miami Canal as a kid. And he walked to the Art Academy to go to school. And my father wrote a paper about his father, and he recounted that his father used to tell yarns about the almost inevitable battle on his daily trip to the Art Academy and back, an evening route which led him through areas where he was appropriately welcomed by the resident boys as a trespasser. Fists and thrown rocks left their marks on both aggressor and victim. It did contribute to his detailed knowledge of every street, every wall, every alley and path, even remotely near the direct path he chose to follow. Those very hillsides were some of his favorite subjects for sketching and watercolors years later. So he grew up in Over the Rhine, and Clifford grew up in Glendale, and they both became best friends at Cincinnati Technical School. And then they both went on to become draftsmen for the really esteemed architectural firm Elsner and Anderson. And then they went off and had a 2-year course at MIT. Then Fred was awarded the Roach Traveling Scholarship. And probably for people who don't know about architecture, that doesn't mean anything, but the Roach Traveling Scholarship exists still today. And there's one architectural student a year in the whole United States who's chosen. And Frederick Garber was chosen to be the Roach Scholar. So he went off to travel through Europe, being inspired by classical architecture. And I think Clifford worked at P&G until he waited for Frederick to come back. So this is a little side story. There's a story is told that when Frederick was walking up the Amalfi Drive in Italy with a traveling friend, they were passed by a man in a buggy who was smoking a distinctly American cigarette. How they did that, I don't know. But they held him up for a smoke, and they discovered he was also an architect. And he was a partner of Cass Gilbert, who was a really famous architect in New York City who eventually designed the Woolworth Building in 1913, which was the tallest building in the world at that point. They ended up traveling together. So 7 years later, after Fred and Clifford started their architecture practice, there was a competition for the design of the Union Central Life Tower. And they won the competition. But the head of the competition said, well, you guys are so young and you don't have experience, I don't think we're going to give it to you. And he said, unless you have someone more experienced or something. And he said, well, how about Cass Gilbert? And they went, fine, that's great. Now, sometimes when you see who is the architect of Union Central Trust, they sometimes say Cass Gilbert, they sometimes say Garber and Woodward. So Cass Gilbert came in on the job. Early on the job, he was part of the design process of developing what they had presented as their design scheme for the competition. And then Garber and Woodward were the managing architects for the building of the building. And then they eventually designed the annex later. So in 1904, Garber and Woodward started their practice. They were both 28 years old. And I just think about, here are these two young architects, they rent a little office, and how do they get going? And who gives you your first commissions when you're baby architects and have your beginning firm? Well, people who know you. So a German man who knew Fred from over the Rhine commissioned them to design an apartment building in Price Hill. So I called up Beth, do you want to go to Price Hill? So we found this apartment building, and then 2 years later they got the design for the Price Hill Library, which was one of the Carnegie libraries, and it's just lovely, and it's had this fabulous modern addition on the back. So if you're ever in Price Hill, go check out this beautiful library.
I should have been there, right?
Now,
Yeah.
when you're doing architectural research and trying to find out buildings that were built and designed by a particular firm, there's this amazing resource called the Western Architect and Builder Weekly. So, unfortunately, the Cincinnati Public Library has in its archives available online from 1904 to 1910. You can look up their archives. So I started looking for every Garber and Woodward building I could find, because that was the first 6 years of their practice, so I wanted to see what they were up to. And what's great on this research, they would have a reporter that would go to each person's office And they would give the address of the office, and then you could step by step, you'd see when someone got a commission, then when the contracts were signed, then it went out to bids. The bids accepted, you could see who was doing the work on the jobs and who are the construction companies. And that's how I discovered in Glendale, this one builder did almost all the buildings in town. So I ended up coming up with 23 pages of single space entries of all these projects. So over those first few years, Garber and Woodward's jobs included large stables for the Cincinnati Railroad Omnibus Company to hold up to 225 horses and vehicles, a grain warehouse, they would do even small, $300 jobs to remodel storefronts. They designed a firehouse, they designed a working girls hotel, the Anna Louise Inn, multiple flats, buildings, and one-room schoolhouses. So I also tracked down where their first office was, because I was self-employed, and I know what it's like, and you're really attached to your office. So it was like, where was their first office? It was in the Johnston building, which was overlooking Fountain Square. And then by the end of the year, they had to move to a bigger office. By the end of the next year, they had to move to a bigger office. And then once the Central Trust Tower was completed, they had an office up on Central Trust Tower where they were until their firm dissolved in the Depression in 1933. So anyway, this is the first mystery on the job. In that record, it said in 1904, a house was commissioned in Glendale by William Alexander Proctor. But where was it? Beth couldn't find it, Martin couldn't find it, was the date wrong? Unbelievably, a week later, Beth got an email from an architect whose family had lived in the village. He had just found in a box of old family papers which included plans for his grandmother's house by Garber and Woodward, built in 1904, paid for by Mr. Proctor. Thanks to Frank Russell, professor of architecture and a distant cousin of mine. It's the Dunbar House. It was the Dunbar House, it was the Russell House, but it was originally called the Mary Kent House. And not only did he have the plans, he also had this beautiful watercolor. And my grandfather was known for his watercolor, and there was his signature. I know his handwriting, there's his watercolor. It was just this amazing, spontaneous. Sometimes when you start looking for things, things start showing up. It's amazing. So anyway, so Mr. Proctor knew the Woodwards, and so he gave this young practice a chance, and he gave them a commission for their first single-family home at 950 Forest Avenue. So there's an interesting story about it being called the Mary Kent House, thanks to Beth's research. William Proctor had two boarders who lived at their estate, Mary A. Kent. Oh, in 1880, Mary A. Kent was 54, and her daughter, Mary Kent, 21, were boarders from Ireland. The younger Mary was described as a music teacher. I was just reviewing my notes from my last trip to Glendale, and I had read a biography of Mother Eva at the convent, and there I discovered that the younger Mary Kent became a sister of the Transfiguration, so Sister Ruth Magdalene, and she traveled as a missionary to start their mission in China, in Wuhu, China in 1920. So it's like, wow, amazing, these little side trips you find yourself on. But anyway, Mary Kent was allowed to stay at this house for the rest of her life and just pay the taxes and repairs. And the other interesting thing is it's 950 Forest, and the house right next to it, you probably don't know, was the original rectory of the church, and it was moved across the street and over. Probably because Mr. Proctor's daughter was the wife of the minister, and he probably thought that they should have a more elegant, appropriate rectory. So the stone rectory was built, the other one moved across the street onto this double lot. So if you look at this house, what you can do, so Beth went through on all of these houses that I'm going to describe, and she described their stylistic characteristics. So the original drawings, this house was once more craftsman style in character, with its wood shingle siding, exposed beam ends at the eaves, bracketed dormers, and the heavy porch railing. So this is how it looks now. This is how houses can change. It's now been colonialized with white paint, placement of the front porch with a two-tiered example of balustrades, and a prominent pedimented bump out on the second floor for a bathroom. If you go around Glendale, you'll see a lot of houses that have a bump out in the middle of their upper porch, and those are bathrooms for when plumbing moved inside. The original raft windows and rafter tails remain, and the craftsman character is more apparent on the side and rear elevations. So Garber and Woodward did okay, according to William Proctor, and they started hiring him for other jobs up on Albion Avenue. So William Cooper Proctor, who was at the Woodlands estate, hired them to design a gardener's cottage. Reverend Paul Matthews, brother of Eva Matthews, who started the convent, he eventually ended up being a bishop in, I think, New Jersey. He did a renovation on his house, which included a billiard hall. I didn't know Episcopal ministers had billiard halls in their house, billiard room in their house, a servant's hall, 2 bedrooms and a bath. But I haven't been able to figure out which house they lived in. But they were next to the convent, John and Lesta Birchnell, Mary H. Johnston, and the Harry Brown family. So I'm going to get research going to figure out which house has the billiard room. And Bethany Home, the convent, also added an addition to the original convent building, which was a half-timber style estate house that was there until it was torn down and a new building built in the 1970s. So in 1909, Garber and Woodward's practices took off. And their first major building was William Cooper Proctor decided to have a summer house on Long Island. And this was his modest summer house, which was built for $30,000. Actually, I should have a picture. My family went there. I have a picture of me when I was about 6 or 7 on the front porch. But then they, the same year, he also commissioned Garber and Woodward to design a house for Alexander Johnston on Albion Avenue, right at the curve where Albion goes up and turns the corner. This beautiful house. So for $10,000, this is what you could get in 1909. For Alexander Johnston and his wife, Anna Titus Johnston, and their daughters. So Beth said this is craftsman style mainly because of the low pitched hip roof with wide overhang and exposed rafters at the roof line. You see, you can start to sort of look at the details, and this will affect how you look at houses when you walk around the village tomorrow. So anyway, William Cooper Proctor and his wife Jane were unable to have children, and they adored and mentored their 2 nieces, Margaret and Mary Elizabeth, who could now live just down the lane from their estate at Woodlands. Also living close by was helpful because their mother died the year they moved into the house. Margaret would eventually marry Charles Sawyer, a lawyer and politician, and they had 5 children before she died in 1937. Her sister, known as Miss Mary, never married and lived with her father until he died in 1951. So here's inside the house. So it's amazing to think she lived here from the time she was 19 until she was 63. So during the time that she lived in this house, she was coming and going on lots of remarkable things. Before World War I, she studied with Maria Montessori in New York and Rome. With the start of the war, she joined the Canadian Volunteer Nurses and was a battlefield nurse in France for 3 years. Following the war, she was a nurse in both Manila and in the remote highlands of the Philippines. After her uncle's death in 1934, she pursued her interest in art as a student in the city before she shifted her focus in the 1940s to careful, studied purchases to establish a major collection of European modern art that would be donated to the Cincinnati Art Museum at her death. Imagine this library with a Picasso and a Modigliani portrait of a woman with a red necklace, and a Braque in the entrance hall, and over the dining room table a fireplace, a Matisse portrait of a woman, and a series of Rouault in the library. After her aunt, Mrs. Jane Proctor, died in 1953, Miss Mary moved into the Proctor estate at Woodlands. After Miss Mary died in 1967, the ownership of the house was passed on to her nephew, then his sister, and 10 years later to the Convent of the Transfiguration. If you look at deeds, I'm becoming more interested in deeds. You can see that Mr. Proctor bought this house from the convent for $1 in 1910. The house was passed from family member to family member for $1, $1. The house was transferred to the convent for $1 in 1967. So here, what I also love about the house is that it was never renovated. Nobody did a 60s fix-up. So it still has the butler's pantry, it still has the old refrigerator, it has this beautiful stairway, and the house is in beautiful condition. It needs some water damage repair, but it's slated for demolition after Christmas. And no one knows why.
Yeah.
So also in 1909, I went to a birthday party when I was 5 at this house. I never knew my grandfather designed this house on ivy. Did any of you imagine? So according to Beth, this is where we're going to get really architectural. This house is typical of the Georgian variant of the colonial revival style, based on the symmetrical massing of the 3-bay wide front elevation, the side gabled roof with front gabled dormers, the brick exterior with corner points, and central entrance with fan light and side lights accented with Tuscan entablature. The windows are typical of colonial revival, but the Palladian windows in the gable ends are Adam elements. That, I think, is exquisite description. I'm in awe of that. So, here's the interior. It's just lovely proportions. Every fireplace has different kinds of tiles. We did a lot of research in 4 different houses. We discovered this green tile in different rooms. Some were in bathrooms, some were in fireplace tiles. I think it's another pottery, not ropewood. Other Garber and Woodward houses have ropewood tiles, but I don't think this is. Okay, so then our next discovery, so 28 Oak Street, this is a house where I grew up, where my father grew up, where his mother grew up. His mother moved there when she was 3 months old. But I grew up there and I thought the house had always been like that. And then I discovered from my cousin Patty, she said, oh, I've got the plans for the renovation that Granddaddy did to our family house in 1909. It was like, so she sent me the plans. It was, and I love looking at plans. And I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. You could see where he expanded the house, put on these beautiful porches. It's like all the elegant proportions. So meanwhile, what had happened is, so this was in 1909. In 1907, Fred married Clifford's sister, Alice. And he and Alice lived in this house with his mother-in-law, Martha Woodward. So in 1909, Martha Woodward took out a loan for a major renovation of this house, adding the porches, bay windows, dormers, and expanded layout of the original 1866 house. And then we also found there was 1 sheet of thin drafting of tracing paper that was of a renovation of the parlor into sort of a medieval library that was done, I think, in the mid-20s, with wood-beamed and paneled ceiling, glass-doored, bookshelves on every wall, and ropewood tiles around the fireplace. So I also discovered in 1909 that Clifford's older brother, George, who went off to P&G at 15, he and his wife commissioned Garber and Woodward to design a house for them on Floral Avenue. And we haven't seen this in any other Garber and Woodward house, and I love that the first floor is local stone. To me, it looks like a Cotswold cottage. But I love I especially love the back wall, the details of the shingled edge coming out over it, and it's clearly craftsman style, right? Yeah. My teacher. So the next thing I discovered, because I thought, I had always heard that the Garbers lived next door to the Woodwards. So, and our house, 28 Oak Street, was a divided house. So I thought the Woodwards lived on one side and the Garbers lived on the other. But there were 4 Garber boys, there were 4 Woodward children. They couldn't fit in that house. And I suddenly realized the house next door to us, which had always been just this house next door, I suddenly realized that was a Garber and Woodward house. So what I discovered is that George and Ada's wife, she had bought these 2 lots. And eventually there would be 3 Garber and Woodward houses. So she was like a baby beginner developer of Garber and Woodward houses in Glendale. So the first one that was built was also in 1909. And this is the Guy B. Taylor house at 15 East Fountain. And I babysat there in the 1960s. I had no idea that was a Garber and Woodward house. So Beth puzzled over the style of this one. The house appears to be a prairie craftsman combination. The contrasting materials of shingle on the first floor and stucco on the second create this horizontality emphasis of typical prairie style. The windows have a multi-light top sash over a single light sash, typical of both styles, but the leaded casement windows with tiny panes in the dormer are more prairie style. But what distinguishes the craftsman style is the exposed rafter ends, the wide shed roof dormer, and the shed roofed entrance porch. So anyway, 1909 was a big year for Garber and Woodward. They also designed 13 other residences in the city, the engineering school and gymnasium for UC, a warehouse, an auto garage, and the ropes wing of the Cincinnati Art Museum. So then the next building I found that they designed was the Woodward House next door. And the way, there was no documentation saying it's a Garber and Woodward house, except that Martha Woodward took out a loan to have it built, and you would think they would keep the design in the family. So we take, that's circumstantial evidence. And the Garber, my dad wrote a biography of his life based on the cars of his life, and he described his dad and Cliff Woodward coming together in the morning, getting in their car, whichever car it was, and driving into the city to practice. And then when the boys were getting older, I think when my dad was 15, he was given a Model T Ford so he could take all the kids to school to Walnut Hills in the city. So this has, it's a lovely, smaller Garber and Woodward house. It's a sort of really cozy family house. So then the next house on those 3 lots is the Loido house where we started. And that is mostly craftsman. It doesn't have exposed rafters. It has the side, except on the side dormer. But it has that multi-gabled, low-pitched roof line with clipped gables, which is typical of craftsman style. And then these are they were so gracious in letting me go through the house, and I got to see the library, which is where a scene in my book about my grandmother takes place, where she drank Marston Allen under the table. So then that was 1915, and the next house is the last Garber and Woodward house in Glendale. It was the Igler or the Whitesides house on 840 Woodbine Avenue. And the house, according to Beth, represents a vernacular form of the prairie style, with its boxy, symmetrical massing, hipped roof with a hipped dormer and tall chimneys. The broad porch with heavy square columns and the front terrace with solid brick railing create a horizontal emphasis and anchor the house to the ground. And here's some details inside. So my current count is that they designed 7 houses and renovated 2 houses in Glendale between 1904 and 1915, as well as many buildings in the city. But after that, they concentrate, which is common of architectural firms. They start out with residential, and then when they start getting more established, then they get commercial commissions in schools, libraries, museums. And they continued until 1933, until the Depression stopped everything. So one of the things that Beth and I would talk about is how can you tell if something's a Garber and Woodward house? And we started thinking about, they made different stylistic choices on the different houses, whether it was craftsman or prairie or arts and crafts, but there was a solid groundedness to all of them. And there was a grace in the layout and the spaces and the archways and lovely details. None of them are the same or repeat, but there's a lot of similar details that we kept finding. And they're solidly built. These houses are all over 100 years old. They're solid, their structural details are true. And what I also appreciate is they built for a variety of budgets, from modest to expansive homes, with the same quality of attention to details in all of them. But now, there are still probably some Garber and Woodward houses that are mysteries, and this is the audience participation part of the talk. There's some sleuthing that you could do while you walk your dog around Glendale. There might be other houses. Beth and I have a list of possible houses. There might be some houses on Woodbine. According to that list, in 1904, 2 cottages were drawn up and were probably built in Glendale. In 1906, they designed a modern brick house for Charles C. Benedict, but we don't know if it was built. There was a 1908, 1909 unidentified Glendale house. In 1908, there was a Christchurch clubhouse gate. Has anyone ever heard of that? So, and then there's some of these houses on Woodbine that have a lot of the characteristics of a Garber and Woodward house. 860 Woodbine. And I went and knocked on doors and said, I'm trying to figure out who designed your house, can I look? And they let me look in their libraries and their dining rooms and their fireplaces and look at the tile, and it was very generous. And then on the same house as the Igler house, on the same lot is this little cottage that was also built in 1915. And did they get someone else to whip up a cottage design, or did they have Garber and Woodward design the cottage that went next to the prairie style house? So anyway, so some fun things to think about. So there's one more Garber and Woodward structure in Glendale, and do you know where this is? So it's the pergola that's behind 28 Oak Street. And the story behind it is that the Garber and Woodward boys were up in Canada for the summer, and Fred Garber said, oh, I have a surprise for you when you get home. And they all thought, a swimming pool. It's the 1920s, what else do you do? And they knew that there was concrete being poured, and they got home and they went, a Greek ruin? This was not their idea of a good time. And it originally had a trellis overhead. But over the generations, lots of us played. It was our fort, it was a place to dress up. You would take, a refrigerator box and make a house and put it up there. And it's currently crumbling, and the present owners plan to restore it.
Oh, nice.
So a friend of mine who became an architect had this love. He said the built environment is about personal experience. And what I love is residential architecture isn't just about the initial design of a house. It's about the experience of the lives lived there. A home is adapted to meet the changing needs of the families who live there. So this is 28 Oak Street now, and it's the Ellers family have done beautiful renovations and taken it into the next century. And it's so wonderful to see how a house adapts and is changed and walls moved and to make it work for a family. So now I get to go back to work on my grandmother's project. And of course it touches on architecture. My grandmother grew up in an American arts and crafts community at the Roycroft in East Aurora, New York. So that's another story. And maybe I'll come back and tell you about that someday. So with special thanks to Martin, the GHP, and to Beth Barger. Thank you all.